In hindsight, I probably should have done this episode a lot sooner. So hey, welcome to the Polytheism episode. When it comes to modern heathenry and paganism, easily one of the first things that comes to mind with members of the public, other practitioners, and the spiritually curious after, say, witchcraft is polytheism, which means that we have many gods instead of one god or even no gods at all. On the surface, that sounds pretty simple and straightforward. But, as anyone who's spent any amount of time in these spaces can tell you, polytheism has a lot more going on than simply there are many gods and practitioners worship those many gods. Polytheism as an idea and a form of spiritual practice has a lot more at work and propping up these ideas than just, well, there's many gods and that's all there is to it. Having a worldview that allows for many different gods to exist within reality and exert their influence in different ways, as well as gods that are not limitless, all-powerful, and all-knowing, brings with it a lot of different philosophical assumptions than what you see in monotheistic influenced approaches, both when you're talking proper monotheism, such as is the case in Christianity, at least ostensibly, or in monotheist influenced ideas, as is far too often the case in mainstream atheist philosophy and reasoning. In this episode, I'm going to break down what polytheism is and why it is important for modern heathen and pagan practice. The way I'm going to do this is I'm first going to start by defining polytheism a bit more, how it's different from monotheism and other concepts of divinity, and some other particular, you could say, under-the-hood nuances that need to be unraveled and worked through to truly understand what's at work with polytheism. I'm going to then spend a little bit of time touching on how polytheism and animism are related to one another and how you could say one influences the other, both historically and in the modern sense. I'll then get into unpacking some baggage around the concept. I will then, after going through that baggage, loop back around to offering a robust defense of the core ideas and practices of polytheistic spirituality, and then I'll wrap things up in hopefully a nice neat package and leave y'all free to go on your way. So with all of that said, let's kick this thing off. Polytheism, as I said before, is a form of spirituality, specifically a form of understanding deity that argues there are many gods. Polytheistic forms of spirituality are documented throughout human history on pretty much every continent except Antarctica. The way polytheism is often described by many modern sources, which are mostly not written by actual polytheists, by the way, and that's important as we go ahead, is that polytheism is treated as a natural response to people's surroundings, that it's a way of understanding their environment and creating explanations for things like why does the sun rise in the morning and set in the evening, what causes lightning, why do the seasons happen, and other similar natural phenomena. These definitions then usually become fodder for the rather entirely too popular argument that polytheism is just backward superstition, that it's a pre-scientific way of understanding the world and comprehending the surroundings of these different societies. Nothing more. Left unsaid and often unaddressed in this particular line of reasoning is then why polytheism was able to persist, and not just persist, but thrive in so many different parts of the world for so long, and in some places, like, say, arguably in Japan, and most definitely in large parts of modern-day India, polytheistic religion is still very much the norm and has been practiced in a similar fashion to their historical predecessors for thousands of years. There's also many examples of societies that were extremely sophisticated in their understanding of things like astronomy, mathematics, engineering, medicine, and all kinds of other scientific disciplines, like the Egyptians, the Romans, the Greeks, and other similar groups who were polytheists for easily longer than Christianity has existed. Now, don't worry, I'm going to get more into that later, but I want to set that up for now as a question to keep in the back of your head. If this stuff was just a way of people who didn't understand the world trying to wrap their brains around phenomena they could not understand, then why would it exist and endure for so long? Polytheism is different from other concepts of deity in that it acknowledges and argues for the existence of many different divine figures. And when I'm saying divine, what I'm talking about are beings that are seen as greater than just any local place or particular natural feature or home or city, and are instead described as having influence over large swaths of human affairs or different natural systems. So, as opposed to, say, a local power that's associated with a specific bay or body of water, you have gods of the sea that rule over all of the oceans. Or, say, you have gods associated with war or justice or any of these other really big, like, crossing society kind of concepts. One consistent feature of pre-modern polytheisms, and this is true to an extent to a lot of modern polytheisms as well, is the boundaries around polytheistic spirituality are very porous and very permeable, which is to say that these different kinds of spiritualities are open to, and historically did, adopt and syncretize with gods and spirituality from other groups and other societies. Sometimes they even mashed gods together to make whole new gods, like Serapis, who was the patron of the Great Library of Alexandria, whose proper name was the Serapeum, which referred to the place as Serapis's sacred abode. There are other similar examples of borrowing and exchange that happened around what is modern-day Afghanistan and Pakistan between peoples who had brought Hellenistic, which is to say Greek ideas about spirituality and gods with them as Alexander the Great's armies moved east, and exchanged and fused together these ideas with the practices of the different peoples of South Asia at the time. Probably one of the best examples of this tendency for polytheistic beliefs, as well as things founded within polytheism, to syncretize and fuse with other forms of spirituality, is the, at times, very complicated relationship with what's referred to as Hinduism and Buddhism. Buddhist philosophy at no point rejects the existence of deities that are outside of, like, say, Buddha and the Bodhisattvas and what have you. Granted, there are some extreme sects that are the exception, but this is not the rule. And while there certainly were Hindu leaders who did not appreciate the existence of these different Buddhist sects within their backyard, there is a long history within South Asia of both these spiritualities existing not always comfortably, but at least side by side, well until the arrival of the first Delhi Sultanate. And in that case, the arrival of the Muslim Delhi Sultanate and their conquest of large swaths of South Asia was detrimental to Buddhist groups, more because Buddhist monasteries by that point had a tendency to also be heavily fortified strongholds, and Buddhist preachers and monks tended to be competing with Muslim imams for the same converts, so things got a bit ugly quickly. Part of why this is the case is because there really isn't one way of doing polytheism. There are actually many different ways, and two of the broadest divisions that you could say exist within modern polytheistic thought, and again, this is modern concepts that have developed, this is not stuff that necessarily historically existed, is the distinction between what's referred to as hard and soft polytheism. Hard polytheism argues that the many gods are each distinct, discrete entities unto themselves, and each one is their own unique power. So basically, Zeus is Zeus and is always Zeus. Odin is Odin and is always Odin, and these two beings are distinct and separate entities. Soft polytheism, by contrast, makes things a little bit more blurry and tends to, if not treat gods as interchangeable, at least see the boundaries between different gods as being much more permeable, and for it to be possible for gods to take on different aspects or appearances. A good example of this in, say, the modern pagan movement is found in Wiccan theology, where the god and goddess of Wicca are also every god and every goddess, and take on whichever gods or goddesses are being invoked, and also can potentially be more than one at the same time. And yes, sometimes this stuff can get a little confusing, but it works, and it works for the groups that incorporate it. Also, along with polytheism comes the concept of henotheism, which is to say that you accept the existence of many gods, but only dedicate worship and devotion to one particular god. A good way to think of it is, I accept that everybody within the neighborhood is out there and exists and is doing their things, but I am only in a close relationship with that particular person who lives across the street. I am not rejecting the existence of the other folks in the neighborhood, and I might have perfectly good relationships with the other folks in the neighborhood, but that particular person across the street is the one who drove me and my partner to the hospital when it was time to have the baby, or, something like that. That there's a much closer connection and relationship between myself and the person across the street. In a similar way that, say, someone who is a henotheistic polytheist may only worship Thor or Odin, while acknowledging and accepting the reality of all the other different gods. What's also implicit here, and tends to be the consensus, though I have run into some exceptions, is that part of polytheism means many gods exist, so in effect, all gods that are attested to and worshipped in some way or another are real. Polytheism, in that way, at its core, is inherently pluralistic, inclusive, and accepting. It does not argue for exclusivity of there is but one god and all other gods are false or idols or demons or something like that. Instead, it says all the gods are real. Done. End of discussion. Now, that isn't to say that polytheistic cultures all just held hands and danced around in rings and made flower crowns for each other or something like that. Absolutely not. We have all kinds of evidence of extraordinary degrees of violence and conflict between different polytheistic groups. But what it is to say is that what's lacking is you don't have the same kind of explicitly religious warfare as the norm, the way that you absolutely do in the history of Christianity and Islam, both against groups who are outside of these different religious societies, as well as against those who are not properly Christian or properly Muslim according to the prevailing norms of the particular region that those folks were operating in. It is noteworthy, for example, in the case of the Roman Empire, that the specific instances of religiously driven persecution, which was to say the Roman attacks on the Jewish peoples of what at the time was referred to as Judea and is now modern-day Israel and Palestine, the suppression of the Druid orders in the British Isles, and the persecution of Christianity, was that these were unusual and exceptional compared to the general Roman policy of sort of a live and let live. As long as those gods are not inciting revolt against the empire, we're really not going to sweat it too much. And by the way, that was the primary justification that was used in those instances, is you didn't have legions marching in going, "You shall bow before Jove or die," or something like that. Instead, they were there because they had been told, these folks are rising against the empire. They are refusing to acknowledge imperial authority and all that, so therefore go out and smash them, which... still not great. I mean, we are talking the Romans. Like, these are people who did multiple crimes against humanity before waking up for breakfast. But they weren't running around putting you to the sword because you were worshiping Jupiter wrong or refusing to worship Jupiter at all. And the Roman Empire doing empire stuff is pretty normal by the standards of most empires throughout history. That's not to say the violence of empire is at any point in history ever justified. But it is kind of worth noting that there is a difference between we're going to leave you alone unless you stop paying taxes or you start assaulting legionnaires or something like that, and we're going to come in and wipe out a whole swath of the population because you listened to the wrong version of the gospel. One thing I'd also like to remark on while we're here talking about the distinctions between hard and soft polytheism and henotheism is you could, within this framework, make an argument that the Catholic Church borders on soft polytheism and could almost be called henotheistic. They do, after all, have more saints than anyone can count. There's also instances of the Catholic Church doing its own sort of light syncretism, like, say, the Virgin of Guadalupe, Saint Bridget, and other similar examples of going, all right, we're just going to repackage this local deity as a saint or an incarnation of Mary or something like that, and keep things going on because, well, the local notable said he wants to make sure the taxes and the harvest come in on time, and it's really not worth the time and effort to make these people stop dancing around with flowers or something. And no, I'm not going to get into the whole confusing minefield that is Christology, even though that is pretty rich fodder for continuing the argument that maybe Christianity is not as monotheistic as it thinks it is. But leaving that for another episode, because Christology, from what I know of it, is a real rabbit hole that I don't have the spoons or preparation to get into right now. Is questions around archetypes and belief. One frequent theory that you tend to see, and this starts because of Carl Jung, is that different polytheistic gods can also be understood as archetypes. Now, there's two different ways of seeing this. One is what I call the cultural archetype theory, which is essentially that these gods don't just represent particular beings, they also represent a whole host of cultural ideas. Like Thor, for example, isn't just the great thunderer who is associated with and said to cause lightning and rain and protects Midgard against hostile entities of different kinds. Thor also represents, in a broad sense, ideas about how to be a man, about how one is supposed to use that kind of masculine strength and power. It's also ideas about how one is supposed to be as, like, say, a working person, as a member of their community, as an ordinary, just caring about other people as well as yourself kind of, existence. That Thor isn't just, oh, here's this being over here that we use to explain thunder and lightning. Thor is a whole set of ideas. Thor is an arena for discourse, a set of symbols and signifiers that are used to convey meaning. What makes this different from Jungian archetypes is Jung then starts getting into stuff about collective unconsciousness, and also in some places winds up going into some really dark and nasty places, like his infamous Wotan essay, or his longtime post-World War II correspondence with Miguel Serrano, a man who has been described as the Julius Evola of South America. And I will get into that man in another episode when I probably do something about Julius Evola, why that guy has really screwed things up for a lot of people, and the problems with his ideas. The core point when we're talking about archetypes in the context of polytheism is that archetypes are, you can take them or leave them. They are something that can enhance and add to the concept without necessarily detracting from them. For folks that engage in a more secular interpretation of practice, which is a growing thing within the pagan and heathen communities, the archetype concept is used as a way of explaining why people who nominally don't accept what they see as supernatural, but see the appeal and power behind the myth that these gods spring from, as well as the different rituals and practices surrounding those gods and the spirituality they're associated with. Which is also a great place for me to get into belief. It is totally valid, as I've sort of implied at this point, for people to have different beliefs around the nature of polytheistic deity. It is perfectly possible and often goes without incident for someone who is much more of an archetype-based heathen to be practicing with an openly and aggressively theistic heathen. And these things can and often do work together pretty well. And the reason for this is, in my experience and in my understanding, belief in the gods isn't exactly the most important thing when you're talking polytheism. And that may be something that comes as a shock to most listeners, because we've grown up in a Christian society, and within Christianity, central to Christian theology is the belief that there is one God, Jesus is his son, who died on the cross for our sins, and by accepting this, you get into heaven and have eternal life after Judgment Day and get to be in the Book of Life and are also considered a good person and a whole bunch of other stuff. And it all hinges on the belief that there is only one God and his son is Jesus. Full stop. Polytheism doesn't really get hung up on that stuff. For theistic polytheists, which I would include myself in that camp, the existence and reality of the gods is something that is independent of whether or not you believe in them. One does not believe that the Aesir, the Vanir, and the Jotnar exist. One accepts them as something that is part of their spiritual world. This is also why secular polytheism is a thing that works, and stuff that is based on concepts like archetypes. Because, well, if belief in the gods is not so much important as it is simply giving respect to what they represent, and not being a dick when you're in ritual space, for lack of a better way to put it, then it doesn't really matter so much what you feel in your heart of hearts around deity, whether you see it as this is another way of my inner voice expressing itself, or this is literally these divinities are communicating with me and I'm communing with them. Whether or not you believe or what you believe is sort of immaterial to the whole question, and I think it misses the point. Polytheism is a way of working with and understanding the world and constructing language rooted in mythopoetic device and method for exploring the human condition. It's not a question of, my God is better than your God. This is where I'm going to get into animism for a minute. Now, animism and polytheism often coexist, and it's very hard to find polytheistic spiritualities and cultures that do not have some kind of animistic component. This is something that is often used by more mainstream studies, which are, again, influenced by that we live under Christian hegemony, to claim that polytheistic ideas are just backward superstition that is used for explaining phenomena that backward primitive peoples couldn't understand, and as a way of trying to assert agency over their environments. This, of course, completely misses the point. Rune Rasmussen's Nordic Animism channel goes into this in way more detail, but to sum it up in a much briefer nutshell, animism is rooted in the idea that we live in relationship with everything that is around us and in our environment. That trees, rocks, houses, other animals, and other beings have agency that must be respected, and that their place within the world needs to be recognized and worked with, and not simply treated as disposable, interchangeable, or purely existing for our own use. This is why it gets hard to separate out polytheism from animism, and why historically these two things tend to exist side by side, or even arguably within the same continuum. Within heathen practice, for example, it's sort of hard to spot the line between the vite of a particularly ancient mountain and a Jotun. One of the best examples of this kind of blurriness that you can find in existing polytheistic spiritualities is in Japanese Shinto practice, where central to the practice are beings that are referred to as kami. And kami are everything from exceptionally powerful, what we would call godlike beings, like Amaterasu, the kami of the sun, Susanoo, the kami of the oceans, and all the way down to, say, the kami of your desk or the kami of your house. These lines are very blurry when you're talking about Shinto, and there's a pretty clear, you could say, almost progression as well as continuum. This also arguably is the case in lots of other places and lots of other forms of spirituality. What also further muddies the waters is we know in historical practice, and to an extent in modern practice, it is much more common and ordinary for people to be leaving offerings to their house spirit or local spirits and other entities that are much cosmically as well as physically closer than the sometimes distant gods. You don't, for example, need to invoke Thor because you lost your keys when you could be asking the house spirit for assistance. And it also actually would be kind of more appropriate to ask the house spirit for assistance because while Thor might have some idea where you left your keys, the house spirit is your home and probably most certainly not only knows where the keys are, but might be responsible for why they've gone missing. So this is where I'm going to unpack a little bit of baggage around polytheism. And that is to say, the two most common arguments against polytheism, which are, first, it's irrational backward superstition, or whatever sacred text it is you adhere to says it's wrong because that sacred text says the God of that book is the one true God. Both of these arguments are actually closely related to each other, partly because the "my God is the only God" argument tended to also, when it wasn't saying other people's gods were demons or something, go for the, well, that's just superstition. They're just ignorant. They don't know any better, that you don't need to be worshiping rocks and trees and stuff. That walks right into the easiest rebuttal ever, and is one that's pretty popular in pagan spaces generally, which is, well, at least the rocks, the trees, the sun, and the ocean are real. They're physically there. They're not some abstract overseer that exists to make sure that you are properly obedient to authority. They are things that exist and exert influence and have a role in our lives. Like, we can't have life without the sun, so it makes sense that you see sun worship as a thing in many cultures around the world. I think you could go so far as to argue that polytheists and animists are the ultimate materialists, because the things we root our spirituality in are things that are things that exist in the world, and things that are necessary for sustaining life, healthy communities, and all that other stuff that's part of the human experience. Even when they get a bit more abstract, like, say, gods of war and justice and stuff like that, you're still appealing to something that is very directly part of the world that you're in. Quite frankly, I see nothing backward or superstitious about giving reverence and recognition to these things that are real and have genuine importance in all of our lives. I think you could even make a case that Christianity's abstracting of deity, its removal of deity from the world and shoving it into this transcendental pose, is the foundation for the kind of modern, extremely disposable consumer capitalism that we live under now. The very same capitalism that, it must be said, is doing a spectacular job of destroying the biosphere and threatening all life on Earth. To put it another way, which view is more backward? That we should care about and give reverence to those things which sustain life and society, or irrationally doing whatever the high priests of the market tell us will make the line go up, make the number bigger, and grow the abstract economy by killing the real biosphere? I don't know about you all, but money doesn't make for very good food. As for the other argument, which is much more explicitly Christian, of, well, your gods aren't real because my holy book says so, that's circular logic on its face. Like, it doesn't need much more explanation than that. You believe your God is the one true God because your book says so, and your God is the one true God because the book says so, and the book was handed down by God and therefore is right and has all the answers. Like, this isn't really an argument. It's an assertion of a perspective. And historically speaking, this was something that, when surviving writings from the Roman Empire, was laughed at by philosophers of the Greek and Roman world when they were confronted with Christian arguments of inerrant truth and all that other stuff. Of going, well, excuse me, you're basing that on that book, which you say is this, but already has its own contradictions and problems and what have you. So why is it that your God is therefore the only God that exists based on that? Like, it's not an argument that is rooted in logic, or at least not in any logic that is stronger or more sound than the person presenting that argument's ability to exert force and violence upon you. frequently that's also generally how that argument tended to be resolved. One line of argument that's got a bit more meat on the bones, so to speak, is the question of why someone would worship a limited polytheistic god, and particularly when we're talking the Nordic gods who will most definitely die at some point in cosmic history, when an all-powerful, all-knowing, etc. deity is right over there and can do more than any of the rest of them can do. More nuanced takes on this will also throw in that the particularly Nordic gods, but many other polytheistic gods, tend to be imperfect, whereas the great and powerful God of Christianity is perfect, all-loving, all-knowing, and all that jazz. The power side of this argument is one that I think entirely depends on your relationship to power. If the reason for seeking spirituality and seeking is to find some kind of authority that exists to give you answers and tell you what to do, sort of be the ultimate boss, the ultimate guide, who's the ultimate parent who makes everything work and takes care of everything, then this question of limitations, and particularly this question of visible flaws, is one that's going to be much more compelling. Whereas if you are looking for a spirituality that has different kinds of relationships, of ones where you are looking not so much for authority that gives you all the answers, but rather a means for you to arrive at answers on your own, and also in cooperation with others, with different gods and what have you, then a polytheistic approach is one that's probably going to be a lot more compelling and interesting for that. I also think that the imperfection in a lot of ways makes these kind of gods more relatable and more understandable than an ineffable, quite frankly, almost alien consciousness that has no real connection with the human experience whatsoever. Whereas at least when you're talking, like, say, the Nordic gods, for example, they get into fights and feuds, sometimes over really petty things. They lie, they engage in deceptive or otherwise questionable behavior. They also engage in a lot of examples of good, moral, and justified behavior. And it's through these actions that we understand both what is and is not beneficial to the world around us, and develop our own way of applying those lessons in the here and now. And that's something that there's a relatability to that isn't really there when you're talking about a deity that is, by its very nature, just beyond all human concern. And while it may be capable of being all loving and all compassionate and all supporting, it also creates an impossible example to be aspiring to, as well as an ultimate authority that in some ways can never really truly be satisfied. Also, I think that part of the acceptance of imperfection, particularly when you're talking the Nordic gods, gives a lot more room for practitioners to say, no, actually, I'm not going to be doing that, or I'm not comfortable with that approach or that understanding or that kind of experience and would rather go a different way. You can say no to a god and still keep being a pagan or a heathen in a way that really isn't true within Christian theology. There is also a certain appeal that comes from knowing there's mysteries even beyond the understanding and knowledge of the gods. Because there's something about that I think inspires you to look further, to find answers to these different mysteries and explanations for what it is that's happening in the world. The fact that even the gods have to go through a similar sort of iterative empirical process to what we do, I think sort of validates so much of the human experience and the process of learning and discovery. That also, to continue on this idea of defending and dispelling this kind of baggage around polytheism, is part of what makes polytheism appealing, is in a lot of ways, polytheistic myth more closely reflects what's in the human experience in terms of how things tend to happen and be caused, and how those effects develop within the world. When you look at many different bodies of polytheistic myth, what drives things like conflict, discovery, and other major developments within myth tends to be the actions and interactions of these different personalities that are at work. And sometimes these individuals and these beings are working at cross purposes. Sometimes they cooperate. Sometimes they openly clash. And these interactions and relationships are what drive these stories, which is, a lot like the human experience, that what it is we're in is people interacting with our surroundings and with each other and with the social realities that we have developed over the course of history, and what the weight of dead generations is pressing upon us even now. This makes polytheistic myth a beautiful body for developing spirituality, for developing conversations and philosophy and discourse around how to effectively navigate these kinds of challenges. Because what's present within polytheism is a world that's also similarly complex. That there isn't necessarily one great source of good clashing with a great source of evil or anything similar that's guiding us towards one true right path, but a whole bunch of competing, sometimes cooperating entities, interests, institutions, individuals that through the sort of push and pull, through the sort of tug of war that is like the human experience, that is myth, that is history, creates something, and something emerges from these things. And there's also a sense of deliberate action and agency that comes within this. Because there is no one perfect, one authoritative source on how everything is supposed to be, there's a little bit more freedom for deciding what should be and how we should do it. That ultimately is what I think is one of the greatest things that polytheistic spirituality, especially as it's being presented by the pagan and heathen movements, has to offer for our modern society. It looks very monolithic models of authority and power in the eye and breaks them down. It dissolves the seeming ineffable barriers which hold up those who exercise influence and agency, and shows the complexity, the fragility, and the malleability of the world around us. They also provide a sense of agency, touchstones, and other points of inspiration for how we can navigate these challenges, how we can move through the world that we're living in, and in a more direct mystical sense, experience with these different perspectives and ideas and approaches, that there isn't just one source to go to, but that there are many, some of whom are more appropriate for some things than others. In a world where possibility and creative horizons are being increasingly hemmed in, there's nothing that can be more potent of an antidote than a different way of looking at things that challenges and forces in a new kind, a new approach to reality, society, and the world. Inclusive polytheism that embraces the inherent pluralism and complexity that comes with this kind of spirituality can be one of those answers and one of those ways that we inject new possibility and new hope in a world that seems to be short on that. So that was my take, more or less, on polytheism. I hope you enjoyed this episode. And until next time, this is Ryan Smith at The Wayward Wanderer, signing off. If you want to find out more about radical heathen practice, head on over to onblackwings.com, where you can find articles, classes, resources, and more. This podcast was created and produced by Ryan Smith. Thanks for listening.